Hello again. So this is the second in the short revision videos on Christian beliefs and teachings from EduCAS RS GCSE course, component 2, paper 2 on Christian beliefs and teachings. So hope you've done some good revision using the push button quiz or the other resources, the topic tests, revision grids on the first section. Let's move on. So the next bit of the topic looks at Christians and creation, or Christian belief about creation, or better, the doctrine of creation. Now, the doctrine of creation, we find a key element is the stories in Genesis 1 to 3. And you need to know what it says. Now, what's fascinating about Genesis 1, first of all, is this series of binaries, of opposites, of pairs that are created. We have the idea of light and dark, the sky and the sea, the land and the plants, the greater and lesser lights, the fish and the birds, the living creatures and the humans. And perhaps we could link these together. And then in a sort of day 1 with day 4, and 2 with 5, and 3 with 6, in a sort of poetic framework, or we could have several ways of interpreting this. We'll look at this in a second. Day 7, God rests. That's important. And it gets picked up later in the book of Exodus in the 10 Commandments that, this idea of the seventh day is a day of rest. For Christians, God thus is the creator of the universe. They believe that whatever the exact process was that created the universe, there are many different theories in this, how do you interpret Genesis with science? God is the overall architect of that creation. Whether he does it in a short period of time or a long period of time, we'll get to later. So the main events described in Genesis describe the creation, first of all, of the whole universe, and then it focuses in on Genesis 2, really, on the creation of the earth, and in particular, creation of Adam and Eve. Then we have in Genesis 3 the temptation of Adam and Eve and the fall from a state of grace to what Augustine in particular talks about the state of original sin. Genesis 1 is very important. It's kind of the title of the whole chapter, and it's like a title. They didn't have titles in those days. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And we get this really interesting bit, which might refer to the work of the Holy Spirit. And God, the Holy Spirit, was hovering over the waters. And then we get this interesting bit, and God said, is that the work of Jesus, the Word? Let there be light, and there was light. And so it continues the first day. Genesis 2, the second chapter of Genesis, focuses then on the creation of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. So in the chapter begins where God creates Adam from the dust of the ground. He kind of molds the dust together like a potter and breathes into Adam the breath of life. And we find that, well, Adam is not happy, even with the animals. Not a suitable helper was found for him. So God has to create a companion, a suitable helpmate. And so he creates Eve. He takes a rib from his side and he creates Adam. And again, now, should we read this literally or metaphorically? We need to understand the type of literature this is. This is mythology, a form of what's called primeval history. It's not just describing, but prescribing. It contains information about how we should act and how we should think morally. It has these mythological themes in it that we need to kind of understand. But is it history? Well, it's a kind of history according to the writers, a kind of primeval history. So some of the language is beautiful. It's and you have to understand poetic idea of the language. It's not just flat scientific or even flat historical language. It's poetic language. And God made the woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. This is the kind of poetic language that would communicate to the audience of the text. And the man said, this is real poetry. It's almost like he breaks out into song. This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And God gives Adam and Eve earlier in this chapter one command. He puts them in this beautiful garden and says, you can eat from any tree, but the one tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are actually two trees in the garden. There's the tree that symbolizes as an icon, a kind of symbol of God's presence, the tree of life. But there's this second tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it represents the fact that perhaps that we have a moral choice that we can make in life. God says you must not touch it or you will die, Genesis 2. So Genesis creates, the Genesis 2 story sets up Genesis 3. It's this creation story makes clear that humankind are special. They are made in the image of God. They are created unique among God's creation. The pinnacle, very last binary, he made him male and female in the image of God. He created them. At the end of, this is the point made by one of the Anglican bishops, Tom Wright, the last of the binaries was male and female. Very controversial today, perhaps. Genesis 2 then describes, or Genesis 3, sorry, describes the fall. Genesis 3 describes the fall. This is Augustine's phrase or a word to describe it. When Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent, who Christians understand as the devil, but that's a way of interpreting it, to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil against what God commanded, against his will. So this serpent tricks Adam and Eve into thinking that if they eat from the tree, they will become like God, as knowledgeable as God. Eve gives in to the temptation and gives some of the fruit to Adam to eat. They confess to God, but as punishment, God sends them from the Garden of Eden. They're no longer able to eat from the tree of life, presumably to live forever, as it were, and therefore they're no longer to be immortal, and death enters the world. Perhaps another way of understanding that is to say that they're no longer in direct fellowship with God, the direct presence of God. This tree of life is the iconic image of a non-figurative image of God. For Christians, this represents the point when God's perfect relationship with humans breaks. For Christians, this is why we are born in sin and shapen in iniquity. As Paul says, Paul and other Christians did come to interpret this as the moment when, if not, they didn't use the word original sin entered, and so we became spiritually dead. And C.S. Lewis says our problem is not that we're bad and we need to be made good. Our problem is that we're now spiritually dead and we need to be spiritually alive because we're separated from God. So this broken relationship is the reason it was necessary for Jesus to die on the cross and his death to pay for human sin and restore the broken relationship with God. It's very interesting at the end of this little section in Genesis 3 that God takes animals, he sacrifices them, and then he covers Adam and Eve in their nakedness with the blood dripping and furs or whatever it was of these animals, the skins of these animals. And their guilt, their shame, their nakedness is covered by these this symbolic covering. And when Jesus comes along, he is this symbolic covering of sin. Deep, weird symbolism in the Bible. It's important that we kind of grasp a little bit. So Genesis 3, the story of the fall. We are made in God's image, so we are good, but we have the power to do great evil in the world. We are sinful and in need of God's forgiveness. Genesis sets that tells us this is the origin of our suffering in the world. Augustine's Theodicy we looked at previously finds its root, its basis in this passage. In Genesis, people have a clear purpose. We are to have dominion over the world, to look after it. But that dominion is really, it's our power, but it has to be exercised responsibly. I guess Spider-Man would come here with great power should come great responsibility, but does it? In the second chapter of Genesis, we find the idea of being good stewards of God's creation, looking after the garden, naming the animals. But instead of being good stewards, we do the opposite. So stewardship being the idea that we have a God-given duty to care for the earth and a responsible way to care for the environment and the animals. Humans have acted as caretakers of God's world to preserve and conserve the environment. But we take our dominion, our ability, our power to control the earth and manage it as good creation. Possibly we do the opposite. So our active role, as it should be, dominion in its best sense should be our active responsibility and role and power to look after the world, given our autonomy, our relative power compared with the animals. We are to look after the animals and look after the earth and the environment. But the problem is particularly as Augustine talks about it, we have this original sin. So we don't act responsibly. We don't do what we should do. So how do we interpret Genesis? This is really important. And this is the dialogue between atheists and Christians, between materialists and people who believe in the material world. It's not all there is. There's a supernatural world. How do different types of Christians interpret Genesis? A Roman Catholic priest called George Lemaitre proposed the idea that the world is not young, but very old. This Roman Catholic priest came up with a theory that was nicknamed by an atheist called Fred Hoyle, the Big Bang theory. Hoyle told this Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, your theory of the primeval atom, your Big Bang theory that suggests the universe began as rubbish. Very interesting dialogue. And today, most scientists accept the Big Bang theory as being the absolute beginning of the universe. And this is a problem. But whether it's a problem for Christians or a problem for atheists is an interesting question. It certainly was a problem for atheists when it was suggested that the universe hasn't always existed, but as it says in Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But for some Christians, the idea of the Big Bang, even though it was created by a Catholic priest, is problematic because of the way it came to be used by atheists like Fred Hoyle and others who followed him. Fundamentalists responding to not only the Big Bang theory, but theory of evolution, suggested that the world is not very old, but very young, and that we should interpret the passage in a particular way. They believe this story to be absolutely true in every detail and word for word truth, and have the sort of literal interpretation of the creation story. Maybe. The problem is the text resists that to some extent. We find, interestingly, for the plants and for the animals, it says the land brought forth. That doesn't sound instant. It sounds like a long period of time. So are they really reading the text literally, or are they just cherry picking bits from the text? Maybe. Liberal Christians who say the story is symbolic, mythological, metaphorical, certainly it is. And the account needs to be interpreted. So they try and avoid any history that is literally claimed in the story. But again, there's a problem with that approach. The text is history. It's not history as we know it. It's called primeval history. It is making certain historical claims. Perhaps it's claiming that the world has an absolute beginning point before which only God existed. And kind of Christians do different things. For example, they point out that the idea of day in the text can mean a long period of time. A literal Christian might think it's only 24 hours, but a liberal Christian, one of the things they might do is say the word yom for day means 1,000,000 years. In the Psalms, it says a day is like 1,000 years in the sight of the Lord. And that's the sort of thing that would be said about this. So there are differences in how to interpret it. There are literalists and there are non-literalists. Christians who believe the Bible should be interpreted literally, regardless of the Big Bang theory. Other Christians who think we should try and understand these theories. But all Christians believe in the doctrine of creation. You couldn't really be a Christian and not believe in the doctrine of creation. That's what's important. They just disagree on exactly how it happens. Now, for Christians, it's not just Genesis. This is important, and it's not, because that would leave you with a very Jewish or perhaps Muslim idea of creation. For Christians, they read other creation stories, in particular, what we read in the book of John. And we find in the book of John, in the beginning, where did we hear that before? In Genesis 1. And in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Where in John 1, verse 5, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was God in the beginning. Wow, the Word is God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So the text itself towards the end says, who is this Word who's moved into our neighbor, who through we find grace and truth? In verse 18, it says it's Jesus. And Christians have come to believe that this Word, and that's the argument of the passage, that is being referred to as God's creative self-expression, that has the purpose and plans for all creation. Through him and by him and to him and all things are created, is Jesus, the second person, the Son of God, of the Trinity. So the second part of the Trinity, Jesus is the Word, is central to the belief that Jesus is part of the Holy Trinity. So therefore they quote, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus is the Word that was present at the beginning of creation, and he is God. Now earlier we talked about Genesis 1 verse 2, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So Christians believe not only was Jesus involved in the creation of the world, but because of what it says in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God, the earth was chaotic and formless, and the Spirit of God was hovering on the face of the waters, Genesis 1 verse 2. So Christians believe, see a picture of it here, here's the Holy Spirit involved in the act of creation as much as Jesus is involved in the act of creation. The Holy Spirit not only hovers then, there are lots of hoverings in the Bible. The Holy Spirit seemed to hover on prophets, inspiring them, creating prophecy in them. The Holy Spirit hovers on David as he composes the music. The Holy Spirit hovers on Mary as she conceives Jesus, who's conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit hovers on Jesus in the story of the baptism of Jesus and confers authority on him as God's Messiah in the story of the baptism of Jesus. We see the Trinity. And finally, the Holy Spirit hovers on the disciples on the day of Pentecost as tongues of fire, creating supernatural gifts in them. And so the Holy Spirit continues his act of creation in the world. As Christians, believe God both creates originally and he continues to create in the world. So that's the second revision topic. Go and do some of the topic tests, the revision grids, the exam packs, the push button quiz, or perhaps even better, go to the website, choose some actual exam questions and practice them. Section 2, Christian beliefs and teachings.